Hey everyone, ready to power up your Spanish? We're doing a deep dive into verbs today, the real engine of the language. Now they can seem intimidating, all those forms and rules. It's not just about memorizing those conjugations, it's about why does Spanish work this way? And we're going deep on everything, from how verbs change depending on who's talking, to those moods and tenses that trip people up.
Even those verb pairs everyone mixes up, like ser versus estar, preterite, imperfect, all that good stuff.
Oh yeah, those get everybody. And what I love is how podcast-input.txt actually takes these concepts and uses them to look at how real Spanish is spoken, showing how even small changes with verbs totally change what you're saying. Like there's that part about how Spanish can just drop the pronoun sometimes.
Right.
You know, you say speak Spanish, not I speak Spanish. Seems basic, but
the document brings up this pro-drop thing. It means understanding the context is even more important.
Exactly. You can't rely on just the words themselves. Got to get the whole picture. So that's why nailing down how verbs change, that inflection, it's huge.
It's like building a house. Each grammar bit is a building block. You got to get them right.
Love that. So first up, person and number. That's about who's doing the action and how many of them are doing it.
Exactly.
I noticed podcast-input.txt had a really clear example with the verb hablar, to speak.
Yeah, they showed how hablo is I speak, hablas is you speak, and so on.
Right.
Each little combo of who's doing it and how many gets its own special form. And that's where that pro-drop thing comes back in. Because the verb ending already tells you who's doing it, you often don't need to say I or you directly.
So you can just say, hablo español, and boom, everyone knows it's you doing the speaking.
Exactly.
Okay, pieces are starting to fit together here. But we got to talk about mood now. And I don't mean how we're feeling about Spanish verbs, though.
Chuckles, right?
Though sometimes it can feel that way. It's more complicated.
True. Mood, in grammar, it's about how the speaker sees the action of the verb. Are they stating a fact, giving a command, wishing for something? That's where those indicative, imperative, and subjunctive moods come into play.
Okay, yeah, the subjunctive. That's the one that always mystified me when I was starting out.
It's definitely unique, but podcast-input.txt, they do a nice job breaking it down. Like they give that example, el chico es aburrido versus el chico está aburrido.
I remember that one.
Both mean basically the boy is boring.
Right. But something feels different about them, even in English.
It's the mood doing that. The first one, es, that's your everyday indicative, just stating a fact. But the second, está aburrido, using está. Subjunctive territory now.
So the first is that's just how he is, but second is more like
he's being a drag right now, not judging his whole personality.
Huge difference. Podcast-input.txt pointed out, subjunctive often pops up with emotions, desires, doubts, all that less factual stuff.
Right, it's about the speaker's attitude towards what's being said.
See, this is why I love this deep dive stuff. Charts are all well and good, but this makes it click.
It's the why behind the what.
Exactly. Okay, we've done person, number, mood, feeling accomplished. But before we go too far, what about tense? That's got to be a whole other beast.
It is, but podcast-input.txt handles it well. They break down simple versus compound tenses and the role of our friend Haber, which...
Haber, don't get me started on Haber. It's like the weird cousin of tenor, always messing me up.
We'll definitely get to those two later on. For now, think of Haber as the helper verb. It comes in to make those compound tenses, adding shades of meaning to the past, present, future, all that.
Okay, so it's like Haber adds the nuance while the main verb is the action itself.
Exactly, it's teamwork.
I like it. All right, so we've got person, number, mood, building our verb fortress brick by brick here. But podcast-input.txt, they spend a bit on voice and aspect too, which, to be honest, always sounded kind of like advanced grammar stuff to me.
They are important concepts, but the text makes them clear. Voice is all about perspective. Active voice is when the subject's doing the action, like the cat chased the mouse. But passive, it's like the mouse was chased by the cat. Focus shifts.
Okay, so it's who's doing the chasing versus who's getting chased.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And then aspect, that tells us if the action is done and over with, or if it's ongoing. The text used a great example, just the phrase, the sun shone. Depending if you use preterite or imperfect tense in Spanish, you're either describing a single moment or like a longer sunshiny situation.
So it's not just when it happened, but how we're talking about it happening?
Exactly.
Like a quick snapshot versus a whole video. Okay, that actually clears up a lot.
Wanted to hear it.
All right, I'm ready to tackle some specific verb types now. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it. The fun's just starting. I'm ready to dig into some of these specific verb categories.
Me too, especially those moods we were talking about, indicative and subjunctive.
Right.
I really liked how podcast-input.txt had that example, el chico es aburrido, versus el chico está aburrido. Both mean the boy is boring, but like the vibe is totally different.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so the first one, S, that's your standard indicative mood, just stating a simple fact.
Okay.
The second one, está aburrido. Now we're in subjunctive territory.
Right.
So the first one, it's like, okay, that's just how this guy is. He's a boring dude.
Yeah, it's in his nature.
Exactly. But the second one is more like, he's being a bit of a drag right now.
Right.
It might not be a permanent character trait, you know?
It's a big difference, even though the English translation is kind of similar.
Right, exactly.
And podcast-input.txt was pointing out that the subjunctive often gets used with like emotions and desires, doubts, things that aren't just facts.
Yeah, anything that's not like 100% certain, you're probably going to use the subjunctive.
So it's about the speaker's attitude towards what they're saying.
Exactly. It's all about how you frame it.
Okay, yeah, it's like choosing the right Instagram filter, right? Content's the same, but the mood is totally different.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Speaking of tricky choices, we got to talk about the preterite versus the imperfect tenses. Those two, I will admit, they've tripped me up many times.
Yeah, they're a big one for a lot of learners.
For sure. And podcast-input.txt actually spends a lot of time explaining these.
Yeah, they do a good job. They have a whole section on it.
They do. It's really helpful. So the main takeaway is both tenses deal with the past, right?
Right.
But it's about the speaker's perspective on the action. So what kind of examples did they give?
Well, they used a really simple one, the phrase, the sun shone.
Okay.
If you say, el sol brilló, using the preterite, you're talking about like one specific moment in the past.
Like it suddenly became sunny.
Right, like the sun burst through the clouds. But if you say el sol brillaba, using the imperfect, now you're painting a picture of like a sunny afternoon.
Oh, so the imperfect is kind of like that wide lens showing the big picture.
Yeah, exactly.
And the preterite is like a zoom lens on one particular event.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
So it's not just when something happened, but how we describe it happening.
And as podcast-input.txt points out, that can really change the feeling of what you're saying just with that one verb choice.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it has a whole other layer of meaning.
It's like those choose your own adventure books. The tense is like which path the story takes.
I like that.
And speaking of choosing the right path, we got to talk about ser and a star.
Yeah, the classic.
Both mean to be, but when do you use which? Every Spanish learner I know has a story about messing these up.
Oh, I'm sure. Podcast-input.txt really gets into the nitty-gritty on these two.
They do, and I love that they go beyond just saying ser is for permanent things and a star is for temporary things.
Right, because it's not always that simple.
It's not.
Yeah.
And they had that funny example, the phrase, tu mama está loca,
Yeah, I remember that one.
meaning your mom is crazy, but depending on if you use ser or a star, you're either saying she's, a little nuts in general or just in that moment.
Right. Big difference.
Huge difference. And podcast-input.txt pointed out that a lot of it comes down to the speaker's perspective
It really is a matter of perspective.
and what they're trying to emphasize with their words.
Yeah, what vibe are you going for?
It's so interesting how Spanish can be so subtle and nuanced.
It really is, especially compared to English.
Okay, we covered some big verb stuff, but podcast-input.txt also gets into some of those weird little things I always found interesting.
Right? The quirks.
Yeah, like they talk about stem changing verbs.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
They're like, why do verbs even do that? But the document makes the case that it's all about keeping Spanish sounding nice. They had the example of pensar, to think.
Yeah, classic stem changer.
It looks like a normal ER verb at first, but then...
And then it's like, surprise.
Right. Pienso, piensas, piensa. It's like that E in the stem is like, nope, I'm an IE now.
Podcast-input.txt actually says that it helps make the pronunciation clearer so it's not just random.
So it's not just me. It does sound weird if you don't change it.
It does, yeah.
Okay, so stem changers, maybe not so bad after all, but what about those IGO verbs? That sounds made up.
I know, right? Like something out of a textbook.
But they're real, and podcast-input.txt had some good explanations.
They do, yeah. So those are verbs like tenor, to have, or venir, to come.
Okay, and they do something weird in the first person.
They add a little something extra. So instead of Tino, I have, it's tengo.
Oh, right. I always forget about that one.
It's like they're trying to stand out.
It's those little things that make learning a language fun. Speaking of confusing pairs, we got to talk about Haber versus tenor.
Oh, another classic.
They both mean to have, so what's the deal?
podcast-input.txt actually goes into the history of those two, which I found super interesting.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So Haber is older, and it was first used to be more like there is or there are. So you'd say, a libro, literally, there's a book. But it's about the book existing, not someone owning it.
So it's more about existence than possession.
Right. Like with tenor, you're saying, I have a book. But with Haber, you're saying, boom, a book exists.
So tenor is our go-to for actually possessing something.
Exactly.
And Haber is more about like acknowledging that something is there.
And it gets even more interesting because tenor can also be used for states of being, like tenor hambre, to be hungry.
Oh, that's right. It's like, I have hunger.
Exactly. It's doing double duty.
That actually ties back into ser versus estar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's all about how Spanish deals with states of being.
It all comes together. That's what I love about podcast-input.txt. It shows how everything's connected.
Right. We went from those basic building blocks, like what a verb is, to those super nuanced mood and tense things, and even those weird irregular verbs that always trip me up. It's amazing how much depth there is to Spanish verbs.
It's a whole world of its own.
It really is. So, to wrap up our deep dive today, just remember, every time you use a verb in Spanish, you're making a choice.
You are.
And those choices, they add up to like your own personal style in the language. So don't be afraid to experiment, make those mistakes, and keep exploring. That's how you really master those verbs and unlock the real beauty of Spanish. Until next time, everyone, happy conjugating.